"You'll birth me 5 sons by spring with that body," the mountain man declared to her, his words as harsh as the winter wind. The Amish girl stood frozen, her plus-sized frame trembling beneath her modest dress as she faced this wild stranger with primitive desires. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The barn fell silent, as though the world itself had stopped breathing. The autumn harvest celebration, usually filled with laughter and hymn singing, froze in a tableau of shock when John Smith burst through the wooden doors. The mountain man's massive frame seemed to dwarf the entrance, his gray-flecked beard wild against his weathered face, eyes scanning the crowd with predatory intensity. Mary Davis had just finished arranging her freshly baked pies on the community table when he spotted her. She felt his gaze like a physical weight, something she was all too familiar with as the largest girl in the community. The whispers that usually followed her around the settlement had momentarily ceased, replaced by this strange electric silence. "You'll give me 5 sons by spring with that body," John thundered, his voice echoing against the rough-hewn beams overhead. Mary felt her fingers go numb. The carefully crafted apple pies she had spent all morning preparing slipped from her grasp, crashing onto the straw-covered floor. Filling splattered across her simple blue dress, but she barely noticed. Every eye in the barn burned into her, some wide with shock, others narrowed in judgment, a few gleaming with barely suppressed amusement. 22 years of being the odd one out, the girl whose dresses needed extra fabric, whose presence at singings meant no partner would approach. 22 years of kind smiles masking pity. And now this stranger, this mountain man everyone with. Susan Davis rushed to her daughter's side, placing a protective arm around Mary's shoulders. But the damage was already done. The moment stretched like pulled taffy, painful and impossible to break. And yet, beneath the mortification and shock, Mary felt something unexpected stir within her chest, a dangerous flicker of possibility. In all her years, no one had ever claimed her, not in hope, not in jest, not in any way at all. She had been invisible, overlooked, tolerated. But John Smith had seen her, and whatever his crude intentions, whatever madness drove him to make such a declaration, for the first time in her life, Mary felt seen. Behind the pristine facade of the Amish community in rural Colorado, an undercurrent of fear rippled through daily life. The rhythmic cadence of hymn singing and the gentle churning of butter masked a growing tension that everyone felt but few acknowledged. Samuel Brown and his railroad men had been making increasingly frequent appearances in the valley, their torches casting long shadows across the peaceful homesteads as they rode through at dusk. "Progress waits for no one," Samuel had declared at their last visit, slapping legal documents against his palm while eyeing the fertile land with undisguised greed. The deputies who accompanied him rattled their jail keys meaningfully whenever the elders attempted to protest. Robert Davis had grown more withdrawn with each passing day, his weathered face creasing with worry as he studied their property boundaries. "They're getting bolder," he confided to Susan one evening when he thought Mary wasn't listening. "The English world doesn't understand our ways." Mary found herself watching the horizon more carefully now, her heart quickening at the sight of any approaching dust cloud. The community's isolation, once their sanctuary, now felt like vulnerability. John Smith understood this fear better than most. Having lived alone in his mountain cabin for years, he recognized the predatory nature of men like Samuel Brown. The mountain man's massive frame tensed visibly whenever railroad matters were discussed, his gray-flecked beard barely concealing the muscle that twitched along his jaw. "Those men respect only one thing," John muttered during a barn raising, his powerful hands splitting a log with a single swing of his axe. The other Amish men exchanged uneasy glances, their own tools suddenly seeming inadequate in comparison. What troubled Mary most wasn't John's strength, but his unpredictable temper. She had witnessed it flare when a deputy made remarks about simple folk who stood in the way of progress. John's eyes had darkened dangerously, his massive hands curling into fists before Sarah Johnson had tactfully intervened. That raw anger could be a wildfire that consumed everything in its path: her family's fragile safety in the community, the delicate peace they maintained with the outside world, and even her own carefully guarded hopes that had begun to blossom since his unexpected proposal. "He means well," Susan whispered to her daughter one evening while they prepared supper. "But a man who's known only solitude must learn gentler ways." Mary nodded, her fingers working the dough with practiced precision. She understood isolation all too well, having lived at the margins of her own community for so long. But unlike John, she had learned to turn her pain inward rather than lash outward, a difference that could determine whether their unusual bond would bring salvation or destruction. Back in the quiet of their modest home, Susan Davis sat at the edge of Mary's bed, her weathered hands trembling slightly. The events at the barn had shaken the entire community, but Susan's eyes held something beyond mere concern. She reached beneath her apron and withdrew a worn Bible, its leather cover cracked with age and constant handling. "There are things you need to know," Susan whispered, glancing toward the door as if fearing eavesdroppers. "Things our family has kept hidden for generations." Mary took the sacred book, feeling its familiar weight. She had read from this very Bible countless times during evening prayers, but her mother's secretive manner suggested there was more to it than spiritual guidance. "Look between Psalms and Proverbs," her mother instructed, her voice barely audible. With trembling fingers, Mary opened to the section and discovered several yellowed pages tucked within. Land deeds and legal documents, their edges frayed, but text still legible. Her eyes widened as she scanned the contents. "This proves our right to this land," Susan explained. "Your great-grandfather purchased these acres legally before joining the faith. The railroad has no claim here, despite what their men say." Mary's heart raced. The railroad's threats had been growing more insistent each month, with Samuel Brown appearing regularly with eviction notices and veiled threats. These documents could change everything. "Why haven't we shown these to the elders?" Mary asked. Susan's eyes clouded. "Your father fears drawing attention. The outside world has its own rules, and fighting them might bring worse trouble. We've chosen peace and separation." Mary carefully returned the papers to their hiding place, understanding dawning. This was why her father had looked so strangely hopeful when John made his declaration. A mountain man with knowledge of the outside world might be exactly what their family needed, a protector who could navigate both worlds. "John Smith isn't one of us," Mary whispered, "but perhaps that's his value." Susan squeezed her daughter's hand. "His ways are not our ways, but I see goodness beneath his rough manner. The question is whether his presence will save us or destroy everything we hold dear." That night, Mary lay awake, the Bible beside her pillow, John's words echoing in her mind. His outlandish proposal had shocked and embarrassed her, yet she couldn't deny the strange flutter in her chest when she recalled his intense gaze. Was this God's plan, sending this wild, unpredictable man into their peaceful community? Was John's arrival the beginning of their salvation, or the first spark that would set their world ablaze? Mary closed her eyes and prayed for wisdom, knowing that whatever path she chose would change her life forever. The winter wind howled through the unfinished barn, finding every gap between the wooden planks. Mary Davis pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as she balanced 3 steaming apple pies between the rough-hewn tables. The warmth from the freshly baked goods did little to combat the biting cold or the chill of judgment that followed her through the community gathering. "Careful you don't break the floorboards," whispered Jacob, one of the younger men, just loud enough for others to hear. Titters of laughter rippled through the room. Mary kept her eyes downcast, her cheeks flushing with a familiar mixture of shame and cold. She had spent 18 years of her life enduring these barbs, learning to make herself smaller despite her size, to move quietly despite the attention her body seemed to draw. The pies, her mother Susan had taught her to make them perfectly, were her offering to the community that never quite accepted her. God values the humble heart, she reminded herself silently, reciting the words her mother whispered to her each night. The Davis family had always stood apart, not quite fitting in despite 3 generations in the community. As Mary set down the last pie, she heard the whispers continue. Sarah Johnson, the community healer, shot a disapproving glance at the mockers, but said nothing. The older woman had always been kind to Mary, treating her twisted ankle last summer without a single comment about her weight. The barn was filling with families gathering for the winter feast. Children darted between tables while the elders discussed the coming railroad threat in hushed, worried tones. Robert Davis, Mary's father, stood with the men, his shoulders stooped with worry. Then it happened. The barn doors slammed open with such force that several women gasped. The winter wind rushed in, extinguishing 2 nearby lanterns and sending papers fluttering from the tables. In the doorway stood a man unlike any Mary had ever seen. John Smith filled the entire frame, his massive shoulders nearly touching both sides. His beard, wild and untamed, was flecked with gray and snow. His eyes, sharp and searching, scanned the room with predatory intensity. He wore no Amish clothing, but instead buckskins and a heavy coat that seemed fashioned from animal pelts. A hunting knife hung at his belt. The room's warmth vanished instantly, replaced by an electric hush as all eyes fixed on the wild stranger. Even the children fell silent, sensing the sudden tension. Mary found herself frozen in place, pie server still in hand, unable to look away from the mountain man. John's gaze swept across the room, passing over faces both frightened and curious, until his eyes locked with Mary's. Something flickered in his expression: recognition, interest, determination, and Mary felt her heart hammer against her ribs. The stranger had found what he was looking for. John strode across the barn with purposeful steps, his boots making no sound on the straw-covered floor. The conversations around him died instantly as the mountain man's massive frame commanded attention without effort. His presence seemed to fill every corner of the space, drawing all eyes toward his weathered face and the intensity burning in his gaze. Mary Davis stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she balanced the remaining pies. The weight of dozens of stairs pressed against her back, but none compared to the force of John Smith's unwavering focus. He moved with the deliberate grace of a predator, stopping just feet from where she stood. "You'll birth me 5 sons by spring with that body," he repeated, his deep voice echoing off the wooden rafters. The words hung in the air, impossibly loud in the silence that followed. Mary's mind went blank. The warmth of the freshly baked pies suddenly felt scalding against her palms. Her fingers loosened involuntarily, and the carefully prepared desserts tumbled to the ground with a dull thud. Filling splattered across the straw, the golden crusts breaking apart on impact. The barn erupted in shocked gasps and hurried whispers. Some of the younger women covered their mouths, while the elders exchanged glances of disapproval and concern. Robert Davis, her father, stepped forward with an expression caught between outrage and bewilderment. But before he could reach them, Mary felt the ground beneath her shift. A strange lightness overtook her body. The faces around her blurred together, their features stretching and distorting as if viewed through rippling water. The whispers grew distant, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in her ears. Mary tried to steady herself, one hand reaching blindly for support, but found only empty air. "She's falling!" someone called out. The world tilted sideways. Mary caught a final glimpse of John's face, his expression transforming from confidence to alarm before darkness rushed in from the edges of her vision. Her consciousness receded like a tide pulling away from shore, leaving nothing but empty blackness in its wake. As she slipped into unconsciousness, a single thought floated through her mind. After years of being invisible despite her size, of being the girl no one truly saw, she had finally been noticed. Not with kindness or cruelty, but with a strange, fierce desire that made no sense in her ordered Amish world. Then, even that thought vanished as darkness claimed her completely. Mary's eyes fluttered open to find herself cradled in John Smith's massive arms. The sensation was foreign, being held as if she weighed no more than a child's doll. The barn still buzzed with shocked whispers, but they seemed distant compared to the thundering of her own heart. "Put her down." Robert Davis stepped between them, his weathered farmer's hands trembling as he reached for his daughter. "You can't just claim her like she's livestock." John's face hardened, his gray-flecked beard catching the lantern light. "I have. She's strong, kind, and I've watched her work these past months." His voice carried across the barn, ensuring everyone heard his declaration. "I offer marriage, proper and before witnesses, nothing dishonorable." The community elder, Bishop Miller, pushed through the crowd, his traditional black hat clutched nervously in his hands. "Brother John, our ways require courtship, permission, prayer. You cannot simply announce such things at a gathering." "I'm not Amish," John replied, unmoved by the elder's words. "But I respect your community enough to make my intentions clear before God and man." Mary found her voice, though it came out barely above a whisper. "Please, put me down." The mountain man hesitated, then gently lowered her to her feet. Susan Davis rushed forward, wrapping a protective arm around her daughter's shoulders. "This is not how we do things here," Susan said, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had guided their household through many winters. Mary steadied herself against her mother, feeling the eyes of everyone she'd known since childhood. Some faces showed shock, others barely concealed amusement. She'd always been the outsider, too big, too quiet, too different, and now this wild man had singled her out in the most public way possible. "I've built a good cabin," John continued, addressing Robert directly now, "tight against the wind, stocked for winter. My land is ready for spring planting. I can provide." The practical nature of his offer caused a shift in the room. Several of the elders exchanged glances. In their community, a man's ability to provide carried significant weight. Robert's expression wavered between outrage and calculation. Mary recognized that look, her father assessing a situation for advantage. The Davis farm had struggled these past seasons, and railroad pressure was mounting on all of them. "This is not a matter to decide tonight," Bishop Miller finally declared, his authority temporarily restoring order. "John Smith, you will leave now. If your intentions are honorable, you will return tomorrow and speak with Robert Davis properly." John's eyes found Mary's across the space between them. "I'll return tomorrow," he said, the words a promise rather than a question. As he turned to leave, Mary realized she hadn't yet decided whether to feel terrified or strangely hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. The silence in the barn hung heavy as John Smith stood before the gathered Amish, his massive frame seeming to fill the space between the rough-hewn beams. His voice, though quieter now, carried the same conviction that had shocked them all moments before. "My cabin sits high on the eastern ridge," he explained, gesturing toward the mountains. "Built it myself, log by log. The walls are thick, sealed tight against mountain winds. No drafts, even when snow piles high." Several of the men exchanged glances. Robert Davis, still positioned protectively near his unconscious daughter, studied the mountain man with wary eyes. "I've stocked enough firewood to last 3 winters, John continued. "Smokehouse full of venison and trout. Root cellar dug deep, filled with preserves and potatoes." A grudging murmur rippled through the crowd. Even the most skeptical among them recognized the value of such preparations. In this harsh Colorado climate, Survival depended on such foresight. "The land is good," he added, his voice softening slightly when he glanced at Mary's still form. 15 acres cleared for planting come spring. Stream runs year-round, never freezes at the source. Sarah Johnson, the community's respected healer, had knelt beside Mary during John's speech. Her weathered hands checked the girl's pulse and forehead with practiced efficiency. "She's merely shocked," Sarah announced, rising slowly with a creak of her knees. "Nothing more serious." John stepped forward, arms extending toward Mary as if to lift her again. "I'll take her." "You will not," Sarah interrupted, her palm raised firmly against his chest. Though she stood a foot shorter than the bearded man, her authority was unmistakable. "She stays with her family tonight." John's brow furrowed, his hands still outstretched. "This isn't how we do things," Sarah continued, her voice gentler but no less firm. "Let her parents care for her. Come back tomorrow when she's awake and can speak for herself." Susan Davis knelt beside her daughter, stroking Mary's forehead with trembling fingers. The mother's eyes darted between John and her husband, silently pleading. After what seemed an eternity, John lowered his arms. "Tomorrow then," he agreed, his gaze never leaving Mary's face, "at first light." As he turned to leave, the crowd parted before him like water. At the door, he paused, looking back once more at the girl who had collapsed at his declaration. "I meant what I said," he added quietly, "every word." Then he was gone, leaving only the bitter winter air swirling in his wake. That night, Mary Davis lay restless on her straw mattress, the rough fabric of her quilt doing little to calm her racing thoughts. Her mother, Susan, sat beside her, gently dabbing her daughter's feverish brow with a cool cloth. The lantern cast long shadows across the simple bedroom walls. As Mary replayed the day's events in her mind, "He shouldn't have spoken to you that way," Susan whispered, wringing excess water from the cloth. "Not in front of everyone." Through the thin walls of their modest home, Mary could hear the heated voices of the community elders confronting John Smith in the bitter Colorado night. Bishop Miller's authoritative tone carried clearly, "You've disrupted our peace. You must leave at once." John's deep voice rumbled in response, unwavering despite the cold. "I meant no disrespect to your ways. Where I come from, we speak plainly about intentions." "This isn't the wilderness," another elder countered. "We have traditions, protocols for courtship." Mary shifted uncomfortably, straining to hear John's reply. "I've watched Mary for weeks from my cabin. She carries water buckets others can't lift. She stacks hay bales that take 2 of your young men to move. She works from sunrise past sunset without complaint." Susan's hand paused on Mary's forehead. They exchanged a glance, both startled by this unexpected perspective. "Her size isn't something to mock," John continued, his voice growing passionate. "It's a blessing. Strong hands for hard work, broad shoulders to carry burdens, a body built to endure, to nurture life." Mary felt her chest tighten. All her life, she'd heard whispers behind cupped hands, seen sideways glances at community gatherings. Her body had always been a source of shame, something to hide beneath loose dresses and downcast eyes. "He sees something different in you," Susan said softly, her eyes reflecting the lantern light. "Something beyond what others have chosen to see." Outside, Robert Davis had joined the conversation, his voice torn between fatherly protection and cautious consideration. "My daughter deserves respect, not to be claimed like property." "I respect her more than those who've made her feel less," John replied. "I offer marriage, protection, a home." Mary closed her eyes, feeling something shift inside her, a tiny seed of possibility taking root where only resignation had grown before. For the first time, someone had described her body not as a burden, but as a source of strength. "Rest now," her mother whispered, smoothing Mary's hair. "Tomorrow will bring clarity." But Mary knew sleep would be impossible. A mountain man's words had unsettled something deep within her. Not just fear or embarrassment, but a dangerous, fragile hope that perhaps she might be valued for exactly who she was. The morning after John's unexpected proposal, the community gathered for the scheduled barn raising at the Miller family's property. John Smith arrived before dawn, nodding silently to the Amish men who eyed him with suspicion. Without waiting for instruction, he removed his heavy coat and set to work. The mountain man's strength was undeniable. He hoisted beams that required 3 Amish men to lift, his massive frame moving with surprising grace. By mid-morning, sweat soaked through his worn flannel shirt despite the Colorado chill. The Amish workers exchanged glances as John felled logs with practiced efficiency, his axe swinging in perfect arcs. "He works like 3 men," whispered Jacob Yoder to Robert Davis, who merely nodded, his expression unreadable as he watched the outsider who had claimed his daughter. From the kitchen window of the nearby house, Mary observed the men's labor while helping prepare the midday meal. Her hands worked mechanically, kneading dough for bread, but her eyes remained fixed on John. Something unfamiliar stirred within her, a mixture of wonder and apprehension. "He's certainly strong," Susan Davis remarked, joining her daughter at the window. Mary's mother dried her hands on her apron, her gentle eyes studying her daughter's face more than the scene outside. "Yes," Mary whispered, watching as John single-handedly raised a support beam, muscles bunching beneath his sweat-dampened shirt. The other men stepped back, their reluctant admiration visible even from a distance. Susan touched Mary's arm. "Strength isn't everything. A gentle heart matters more." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your father was never the strongest in the fields, but he has shown me tenderness every day of our marriage." Mary turned to her mother, uncertainty clouding her features. "Do you think John has gentleness in him?" Susan considered the mountain man, who now patiently demonstrated a more efficient cutting technique to a young Amish boy. "I think there's more to him than he shows. But marriage isn't built on strength alone, or even love at first sight. It grows slowly, like winter wheat under snow." Mary nodded, her gaze returning to John. He looked up suddenly, as if sensing her attention, and their eyes met across the distance. He offered a small, uncertain nod, so different from his bold declaration in the barn. "I'm afraid," Mary admitted quietly. Susan squeezed her daughter's hand. "Fear is natural, but remember, you have strength too, not just in your body, but in your spirit. God doesn't make mistakes in how He shapes us." Mary took a deep breath, drawing comfort from her mother's wisdom as she watched John return to his work, his movements powerful, yet increasingly in harmony with the community's rhythm. The Davis family dinner table had never felt so small. John Smith sat awkwardly on a bench clearly not built for a man of his stature, his knees nearly touching the underside of the wooden table. He watched carefully as Robert Davis led the family in prayer, his massive hands folded in imitation, lips moving silently as he tried to follow along. Mary noticed how he struggled with the unfamiliar customs, holding his fork incorrectly, reaching for food before the blessing, drinking too deeply from his water cup. Yet there was something endearing about his earnest attempts to fit in, to honor their ways despite his discomfort. "The potatoes are excellent," John said, his voice too loud for the quiet room. Susan Davis offered a gentle smile, the first genuine one Mary had seen her mother direct toward their unusual guest. "Mary prepared them," Susan replied. "She has always had a way with simple foods." Throughout the meal, Mary felt John's gaze return to her repeatedly, studying her with an intensity that made her cheeks burn, not with shame, as she was accustomed to feeling when others stared, but with something unfamiliar, a warmth that spread from her face to her chest. When the plates were cleared and the evening Bible reading completed, an expectant silence fell over the room. The moment had arrived, and everyone knew it. Robert cleared his throat, nodding almost imperceptibly toward John. The mountain man straightened his back, his chair creaking beneath him. "I've come to ask properly," he announced, his eyes never leaving Mary's face. "Will you be my wife?" The directness of his question hung in the air. In that moment, Mary felt something shift inside her. A lifetime of ducking her head and accepting whispers transformed into an unexpected courage. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze directly. "If you want me," she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected, "you'll follow our ways. Courtship, no touching, no rushing." She swallowed hard before continuing. "Our traditions matter to me." A murmur of approval rippled through the family members gathered around the table. Even her younger cousins, who had often joined in the teasing about her size, looked at her with newfound respect. John's expression remained serious, but something in his eyes softened. "I can learn," he said simply. "I will learn your prayers, your songs, your ways." He looked around at the Davis family before returning his attention to Mary. "I've lived alone too long. I want to do this right." Robert nodded, satisfaction evident in his posture. Susan reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand. "Then we begin properly," Mary said, surprised by her own boldness. "With patience and faith." In the quiet of her room, Mary Davis knelt beside her narrow bed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. The moonlight filtered through the simple curtains, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. She closed her eyes, searching for words that wouldn't come easily. "Lord," she whispered, "I don't understand your plan." Her voice caught, barely audible even to herself. "Is this man your answer, or my trial?" For years, Mary had endured the sidelong glances, the whispered comments about her size, the way mothers pulled their sons away when matchmaking discussions began. She had built walls around her heart, accepting that perhaps she was meant for service rather than love. Yet now, everything had changed with John Smith's thunderous declaration. She rose and moved to the small mirror hanging on her wall. The young woman staring back seemed different somehow. The same full cheeks and sturdy frame, but her eyes held something new. Was it hope, or merely foolishness? Mary touched the worn Bible her mother had given her, tracing its leather binding. Susan had always told her that God made no mistakes, that her body was exactly as it should be. But believing those words had grown harder with each passing year of loneliness. "Is it wrong," she murmured to the empty room, "to want someone to choose me, to see value where others see only burden?" Outside, she could hear the low rumble of men's voices, her father Robert discussing something with the elders. They were deciding her fate, as they always had. But this time felt different. This time a wild, unpredictable element had entered their ordered world. John's intensity frightened her. His bluntness shocked her. Yet when he looked at her, she saw no mockery in his eyes, only certainty. He spoke of her strength as though it were beautiful, not shameful. Mary sank onto the edge of her mattress, remembering how her heart had raced when he lifted her as if she weighed nothing. No man had ever touched her with such ease, such confidence. "Am I betraying our ways by wanting this?" she whispered to the darkness. The Amish life was one of submission, of community over self. Was her yearning for John's attention merely vanity? She pulled her quilt around her shoulders, seeking comfort in its familiar weight. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more scrutiny from the community. Sarah Johnson had already visited, ostensibly to check her health, but Mary had seen the curiosity in the healer's eyes. Mary closed her eyes again, a single tear tracking down her cheek. "Please," she prayed, "if this is your will, give me strength. And if it's not, give me the wisdom to know the difference." As winter settled over the Colorado Valley, John Smith became a fixture in the Davis household. Each morning, he would arrive before sunrise, his massive frame casting long shadows across the snow as he chopped firewood or repaired tools damaged by the harsh weather. The Amish neighbors who had once whispered behind their hands now nodded in cautious greeting when he passed. In the afternoons, John could be found surrounded by a circle of wide-eyed Amish children, teaching them to whittle simple animals from pine scraps. His large hands, once instruments of violence, now moved with surprising gentleness as he guided small fingers away from sharp edges. "Like this," he would murmur, his deep voice softer than anyone had ever heard it. "Slow and steady wins the race." Mary Davis watched these transformations with quiet wonder. Each evening, she sat beside him on the wooden bench, their shoulders nearly touching as she helped him navigate the worn hymnal. "Follow my finger," she would say, tracing the unfamiliar words. John's brow would furrow in concentration, his gray-flecked beard twitching as he struggled to match her clear soprano with his rumbling bass. "You're improving," she told him one night, and the smile that broke across his weathered face made her heart flutter unexpectedly. The family gatherings by the hearth became the center of their days. Susan Davis would serve hot cider in clay mugs while Robert read from scripture. John's presence, once awkward and intrusive, gradually became as natural as the crackling fire itself. He asked thoughtful questions about Amish ways, his genuine curiosity warming even the most skeptical hearts. Yet peace remained elusive. Whispers followed them at community gatherings. Tales of John's violent past in the mountains, exaggerated stories of confrontations with lawmen and trappers. Mary pretended not to hear, but she noticed how John's shoulders would tense, how his eyes would darken with shame. More troubling were the railroad men who appeared with increasing frequency at the edges of Amish properties. Samuel Brown had been seen in town, waving documents and speaking to county officials. Sarah Johnson brought news that 3 families north of the valley had already been forced to relocate. "They won't stop coming," Robert confided, one night after the women had retired. "The railroad wants this land, and they have the law on their side." John stared into the dying embers. "Not all law is just," he said quietly, "and not all men bow to unjust demands." The words hung in the air between them, a comfort and a warning. Their fragile peace might not survive the coming storm, but neither would they surrender without a fight. The community meeting hall fell silent as Samuel Brown strode through the door. His polished leather briefcase a stark contrast to the simple wooden furniture. The railroad agent's pressed suit and city cologne seemed to contaminate the pure air of the gathering place. "Progress requires sacrifice," Samuel declared, spreading legal documents across the oak table where the elders sat. "The railroad's expansion can't be delayed for sentiment. These notices give you 30 days to vacate." Robert Davis's face went ashen as he studied the papers. "This land has been in our care for generations," he protested, his voice barely audible. John Smith's massive frame tensed beside Mary, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the bench. She could feel the heat of his anger radiating like a furnace. When he started to rise, Mary placed her hand gently on his forearm. "Violence won't solve this," she whispered, her touch anchoring him. The mountain man settled back, though his eyes never left Brown's smug expression. "The company has offered fair compensation," the agent continued, tapping a figure on one document that made several elders gasp. "Though I should warn you, those who resist will receive considerably less." Susan Davis stepped forward, her quiet dignity a shield against his intimidation. "We'll need time to pray on this matter," she said firmly. Brown's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Prayer won't stop progress, ma'am, but it might comfort you while you pack." After he departed, the community erupted in fearful discussion. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, while men argued in hushed, urgent tones. Mary watched her father join the elders. His shoulders slumped with the weight of responsibility. Later that evening, as moonlight silvered the snow-covered fields, Mary found John standing at the edge of the property, staring at the distant mountains. "I wanted to kill him," he admitted without turning, "for threatening your home, for making your father look broken." Mary stood beside him, their breaths forming twin clouds in the frigid air. "That's not our way." John finally looked at her, his face softened by moonlight. "I know, and I'm trying to learn your path." He gestured toward the foothills. "I have land there, good land. If the worst happens, I'll build you a home, a sanctuary for you and your people." Mary's heart swelled at his words. Not just a cabin for a wife, but a refuge for her community. "You'd do that?" she asked. "For you," he said simply. "I came here seeking sons and found something I never knew I needed: belonging." Mary gazed at the moonlit landscape, seeing not just what might be lost, but what might be gained. "We'll find a way through this together," she promised, her voice stronger than she'd ever heard it. February brought the heaviest snowfall Colorado had seen in years. The white blanket stretched across the valley, transforming the landscape into a silent, pristine wilderness. Despite the bitter cold, Mary Davis and John Smith worked tirelessly on their cabin each day, their breaths forming clouds in the frigid air. Mary's hands, once soft from kneading dough and churning butter, now bore the marks of their labor. Blisters formed and broke, only to callous over as she learned to handle tools that had never been part of her Amish upbringing. She winced as she hammered another nail, but refused to complain. "You're getting good at this," John remarked, his massive frame silhouetted against the snow-bright window. He moved with surprising gentleness as he showed her how to plane wood for the floorboards. Most folks would have given up by now. Mary smiled, tucking a strand of hair back under her prayer cap. "My father always said persistence matters more than talent." As they worked side by side, John's gruff exterior continued to soften. One evening, as they paused to warm their hands by the small stove, he looked at her with an intensity that made her heart quicken. "You give me purpose," he said simply, the words hanging between them like something precious and fragile. Back in the community, however, not everyone approved of their courtship. Mary overheard whispers during Sunday service, some mocking, some fearful. Elizabeth Yoder, who had always been quick with cruel words, didn't bother lowering her voice. "Can you imagine them together? She'll crush him in their marriage bed," she snickered to her friends. The words stung, but Mary held her head high as she walked past. The healer, Sarah Johnson, squeezed her arm in silent support. That evening, in her family's home, Mary stood before the small mirror her mother kept for mending clothes. She studied her reflection, the fullness of her face, the strength in her shoulders, the curves that had brought her so much shame. But now, looking at her calloused hands and the determination in her eyes, she saw something different. "You're more than what they see," Susan Davis said, appearing behind her daughter. The older woman's eyes were kind in the lamplight. "John sees it. Your father and I have always seen it." Mary nodded, squaring her shoulders. "I'm building a life," she whispered, "not just a house." As February deepened, so did their connection. When John taught her to split logs, his hands guiding hers on the axe handle, Mary felt a strength inside herself that had nothing to do with the opinions of others. Together, they were creating something that would withstand both winter storms and whispered cruelties, a foundation strong enough to build a future upon. As the winter nights grew longer, Mary and John found themselves drawn to the warmth of the Davis family hearth. With flames dancing against the cabin walls, John Smith gradually revealed pieces of his past that had remained buried beneath years of solitude. "My father left when I was 8, he confessed one evening, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire. "Mother died the following winter. Neighbors took me in, but I was always the extra mouth to feed." Mary sat quietly beside him, her hands busy with mending as she listened. Susan Davis moved silently in the background, preparing tea while Robert pretended to whittle, though his ears caught every word. "I learned to hunt because I had to," John continued. "By 13, I was living more in the woods than in town. The mountains don't judge you for being different." Each night, another layer of his armor fell away. He spoke of fights that left him scarred, of winters spent alone in makeshift shelters, and of the cabin he'd built with his bare hands, a fortress against a world that had never wanted him. Mary began teaching him prayers, simple ones at first. His large fingers would fumble with the small Bible pages, his deep voice stumbling over unfamiliar words. "The Lord is my shepherd," he would repeat after her, the ancient words awkward on his tongue. "I shall not want," Mary would continue, her patience never wavering. With each prayer, something softened in him. The mountain man who had stormed into the barn months ago was slowly transforming, though his strength remained undiminished. Everything changed at the community hymn singing. Mary had spent extra time on her appearance, hoping to blend in rather than stand out. As they entered the gathering, whispers followed them like shadows. During a break between hymns, she overheard Jacob Miller and his friends huddled near the refreshment table. "5 sons?" Jacob snickered. "He'll need to find them under all that." The cruel words struck Mary like physical blows. Before John could react, she fled, pushing through the door into the biting cold, tears already freezing on her flushed cheeks. The snow crunched beneath her boots as she ran blindly into the woods. The cold air burned her lungs, but the pain inside hurt worse than any winter chill. She heard his footsteps behind her, steady and determined. John caught up easily but didn't touch her, simply walking beside her until she stopped by a snow-covered pine. "They'll never accept me," Mary whispered, her breath clouding before her. John stood beside her, his presence solid as the mountains themselves. "I don't need them to," he said simply. "You're the only one who ever made me feel less alone." In the moonlight reflecting off the snow, Mary saw the truth in his eyes, and for the first time, she truly believed him. The first blossoms of spring dotted the landscape as Mary Davis and John Smith's wedding day arrived. The community had gathered in the barn, transformed with simple decorations of fresh wildflowers and handmade candles. Mary's wedding dress, sewn by her mother Susan over long winter evenings, hung perfectly on her strong frame. For once, she felt beautiful, her size a testament to her resilience rather than a source of shame. John stood tall beside the bishop, his beard neatly trimmed, his eyes never leaving Mary as she walked toward him. The ceremony had barely begun when the doors burst open. Samuel Brown entered, flanked by 3 deputies, their badges gleaming against dark uniforms. "Apologies for interrupting," Brown announced without sincerity, "but we have business that can't wait." His gaze settled on Mary with undisguised contempt. "Though I'm surprised anyone would want to marry such a hefty bride. How many men did you have to reject before settling on this mountain savage?" A collective gasp rippled through the gathering. John's hands clenched into fists, but Mary placed her palm against his arm, silently urging restraint. Robert Davis stepped forward. "This is a sacred ceremony. Please leave." "Sacred?" one deputy laughed. "Nothing sacred about land thieves. We have orders to clear this valley by month's end." He shoved Robert backward. "Maybe your fat daughter can roll downhill and take you all with her." The insult hung in the air for only a second before John lunged forward. His fist connected with the deputy's jaw with a sickening crack. The man crumpled, blood streaming from his mouth. John grabbed him by the collar, raising his fist again. "John, stop!" Mary cried out. 3 elders rushed forward, pulling John away as the remaining deputies drew their weapons. The fallen man sputtered through broken teeth. "Assault on an officer? You're finished." Within minutes, they had John in handcuffs. Mary reached for him, tears streaming down her face. But the deputies pushed her roughly aside. "Your wedding night will be spent alone," Brown sneered. "If he's lucky, he'll only serve 5 years." After they dragged John away, the barn emptied quickly. Susan helped Mary remove her wedding dress, hanging it carefully on a peg where it swayed like a ghost in the evening breeze. That night, whispers traveled between households. Some blamed John's wild nature, others the railroad's cruelty. A few even suggested Mary should have accepted her place instead of reaching for happiness. In her bedroom, Mary stared at the ceiling, her wedding dress casting moon shadows on the wall. Everything they had built together now hung by the thinnest thread, threatened by violence from both sides of their fragile world. The jail reeked of stale sweat and despair. Mary Davis clutched her worn Bible against her chest as the deputy led her down the narrow corridor. Steel bars cast striped shadows across the concrete floor, and somewhere in the distance, a man wept. John Smith sat hunched on a thin mattress, his massive frame making the cell seem even smaller. When he looked up, his eyes widened with surprise. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, rising to his feet. The chains at his wrists clicked softly. "I won't abandon you," Mary replied, her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. She'd never imagined visiting anyone in jail, let alone the man who'd declared he wanted her to bear his children. The deputy left them with a warning. 10 minutes. Mary pressed her Bible against the bars. "I brought this for you." John's weathered hands reached for the book, their fingers brushing momentarily. "I almost killed that man," he admitted, his voice hollow. "Everything I promised you about changing, I failed." "You stopped," she reminded him. "That matters." The mountain man shook his head, gray-flecked beard catching the weak light from the corridor. "They're right about me. I'm just violence wrapped in skin." Mary leaned closer to the bars. "True strength is restraint," she whispered. "Not the ability to hurt, but the choice not to." His eyes met hers, searching for judgment, but finding only compassion. "How can you still look at me like that, after what I've done?" "Because I see who you're becoming, not just who you've been." When their time ended, Mary walked home through the cold spring air, her heart heavy but resolved. The Davis family home stood silent as she entered, finding Susan waiting by the hearth. "How is he?" her mother asked, hands busy with mending. Ashamed, afraid, Mary sank into a chair, but not broken. Susan set aside her work and crossed to an old chest. "There's something you need to see." From beneath layers of quilts, she withdrew a yellow document. "Your father's grandfather secured this land legally. The railroad men know it, but they're counting on our unwillingness to fight." Mary unfolded the lease with trembling fingers. The formal language confirmed what her mother said. Their claim to the valley was legitimate and binding. "Why didn't you show this before?" she asked. "The elders believe in submission, not resistance," Susan explained. "But sometimes faith requires us to stand firm." Mary traced the signatures at the bottom of the page. This document could save not just their home, but the entire community. Yet using it meant challenging authority, drawing attention, everything the Amish avoided. "John would know what to do with this," she murmured. "And what would Mary do?" her mother asked gently. Looking down at the lease, Mary felt something unfamiliar bloom within her chest. Not the shame she'd carried for years, but courage. For the first time, she understood that her strength wasn't just in her body, but in her heart. The railroad men returned at dawn, this time with uniformed soldiers flanking Samuel Brown. Their boots trampled the fresh spring grass as they marched toward the Amish settlement. Mary Davis watched from her window, heart pounding against her ribs as the men approached with official-looking papers and stern expressions. Without waiting for her parents to stop her, Mary hurried to the community hall, where the elders had gathered in emergency council. Whispers fell silent as she entered. Bishop Miller's weathered face showed resignation, while others avoided her gaze entirely. "They're saying we must leave by sundown," one elder announced, his voice breaking. Mary stepped forward, her hands trembling but her stance firm. "We cannot abandon this valley," she declared. Though her voice quavered, it carried throughout the room. "Our claim is legal. Let the law decide, not threats or violence." The elders exchanged troubled glances. Robert Davis rose to stand beside his daughter, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "What do you propose, child?" asked the bishop. Mary pulled the worn Bible from her apron pocket, carefully extracting the folded lease her mother had shown her. This document proves our right to this land. The railroad cannot simply take what is legally ours. Several elders leaned forward, examining the yellowed paper with newfound hope. I need to consult with John, Mary insisted. He understands these matters better than we do. Though some protested, Robert supported his daughter's request. John Smith may not be one of us, but his heart is true. He would give his life to protect our community. Within the hour, Mary sat across from John in the jailhouse, a deputy watching from the corner. Despite his chains, John's eyes lit up at the sight of her. "They've brought soldiers," Mary whispered, sliding the lease across the table. John studied the document carefully, then looked up with a quiet intensity. "This is strong evidence, but we must approach this without anger or threats." "Can you do that?" Mary asked, remembering his fierce temper. John reached across the table, his fingers stopping just short of hers. "You've taught me that true strength isn't in my fists. I pledge to support you with humility, not rage." Together, they formulated a plan, one that would use truth as their weapon. When Mary rose to leave, John's voice stopped her. "Your courage gives me faith," he said softly. "We will fight this battle with words and law, not violence." Mary nodded, a new confidence straightening her spine as she prepared to face Samuel Brown and his soldiers, with nothing but truth and the quiet strength she'd discovered within herself. The courthouse fell silent as Mary Davis stood before the judge, her hands steady as she unfolded the worn document. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating the lease her mother had hidden within the Bible's pages for safekeeping. Her voice, once timid in crowds, now carried clearly across the wooden benches where both Amish families and railroad representatives sat in tense anticipation. "This land has belonged to our community legally for 3 generations, she explained, pointing to signatures and dates that Samuel Brown had claimed never existed. The railroad agent's face darkened as the judge examined the document with careful attention. From the corner of her eye, Mary could see John Smith being led in, chains rattling with each step. Despite his restraints, he stood tall, his eyes finding hers immediately across the crowded room. The mountain man looked different today, humbled, yet somehow stronger in his quietness than he had ever appeared in his rage. When called to testify, John surprised everyone. "I admit guilt to pride and anger," he stated plainly, "but not to defending innocent people from unlawful threats." His beard, now neatly trimmed for court, couldn't hide the sincerity in his expression as he continued. "I've learned from Mary that wisdom accomplishes what violence never could." Samuel attempted to paint the Amish as backward obstacles to progress, but his arguments crumbled against the legal document Mary had presented. Robert Davis watched his daughter with undisguised pride, while Susan squeezed her husband's hand, tears glistening in her eyes. The judge, a gray-haired woman with piercing eyes, studied the lease one final time before delivering her verdict. "The court finds in favor of the Davis family and their community. The railroad's claim is invalid in light of this documented lease." With a sharp rap of her gavel, she added, "Furthermore, Mr. Smith is to be released immediately." A deputy stepped forward to remove John's chains as murmurs of relief rippled through the Amish gathering. Sarah Johnson, who had testified to John's changed character, nodded in quiet satisfaction. Outside the courthouse, sunshine bathed the gathering in warmth as neighbors who had once whispered about Mary now approached with congratulations. Children ran circles around adults who stood in clusters, planning a celebration feast. John, finally free, moved carefully through the crowd until he reached Mary's side. "You saved us all," he said simply, not touching her, but standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Mary shook her head. "We saved each other." As they walked toward the waiting carriages, the entire valley seemed to exhale in collective relief. Their homes were secure, their community intact, and tomorrow would bring a new beginning. Golden sunlight streamed through the simple windows of the Amish church, casting warm patterns across the wooden floor where Mary Davis and John Smith stood before their community. The once judgmental faces that had surrounded them for months now shone with something Mary had rarely seen directed at her: genuine respect and acceptance. Mary's wedding dress, once a symbol of dashed hopes, now draped her strong frame beautifully. Her mother, Susan, had worked through nights, adding delicate stitching that highlighted her daughter's natural grace rather than attempting to disguise her size. John gazed at his bride with reverence, his massive frame somehow gentler in his borrowed formal clothes, his beard neatly trimmed for the occasion. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder," the bishop pronounced, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed church. The words seemed to release years of tension from Mary's shoulders. She squeezed John's calloused hand, remembering the journey that had brought them here. From his shocking declaration in the barn to courthouse battles and personal transformations. Robert Davis watched his daughter with misty eyes, no longer seeing her marriage as mere salvation from financial troubles, but as the blessing it truly was. Even Sarah Johnson, who had once cautioned Mary against rushing into marriage with the mountain man, nodded approvingly from her seat among the elders. After the ceremony, the community gathered for a feast that celebrated not just the union of two souls, but their collective victory against the railroad's threats. Samuel Brown was notably absent, having been reassigned after the court ruling preserved the Amish land rights. As evening fell, the newlyweds made their way to John's cabin, now their cabin, which stood as testament to their shared labor. The rough-hewn walls had been insulated against Colorado's harsh weather, and inside, handmade furniture awaited them, including a quilt Susan had secretly crafted from scraps of meaningful fabrics. In the quiet of their first night as husband and wife, they knelt together beside their bed. John's prayer came haltingly at first. Then, with growing confidence, words of gratitude for second chances and newfound family. "I never thought I'd find peace," he whispered after they finished praying, his voice thick with emotion. "Or that someone would see past my rage to what I could become." Mary touched his face gently. "And I never imagined someone would see strength where others saw only size." They embraced, two once lonely souls finding harbor in each other. Not through the bold declaration that had started their journey, but through the patient building of trust, respect, and love that had transformed them both.